New gardener arrives for work with a baby strapped to her chest. The Mafia boss sees her and does something no one expected. The iron gates of the Ashford estate groaned as Arden Shaw pushed them open with her shoulder, clutching her 7-month-old son against her chest. 6 in the morning. Mist still clung to the manicured lawns. She needed this job. 4 months of overdue rent, debt collectors hunting her for her dead husband's mistakes, and a baby to feed didn't leave room for honesty. So yes, she had lied about her experience, but not about her desperation. She knocked on the back door. No answer. She knocked harder. Jasper stirred and whimpered. "Shh, sweetheart," she whispered. "Mommy just needs this one chance." The door swung open, and the man standing there was not the housekeeper. He was tall, dark hair still damp, a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, eyes gray and cold as winter steel. Tattoos crawled up his right arm. Everything about him screamed danger. "You must be the gardener," he said. No warmth, no welcome. "Yes, Mr. Ashford. What is this?" His gaze dropped to the baby. His jaw tightened. Arden's stomach dropped. "This is my son, Jasper. This is a workplace, not a daycare." He stepped back. "Leave." But Jasper chose that moment to open his eyes. He looked at the terrifying man towering over them and smiled. A pure, innocent smile. Kian Ashford froze. Something flickered across his face. Gone in an instant. "Mr. Ashford, please." Arden's voice cracked. "I have no one. No family. No money. Nowhere to go. I'll work harder than anyone you've ever hired. Just give me a chance. You lied to get this job." "Yes. No point denying it now." "And you expect me to trust you?" "I expect nothing." Arden lifted her chin, tears streaming down her face. "But my son needs to eat. He needs a roof. I'm begging you." Silence. Kian's eyes moved from her face to the sleeping baby, his expression unreadable. "1 month," he said finally. "Prove yourself. The child interferes. You're gone. The plants die. You're gone. You cause any trouble?" His voice dropped. "You disappear. Understood?" The threat was real. Arden knew exactly what kind of man stood before her. Understood. He turned to leave, then paused. "Start with the back garden. The one with the old oak tree." Something dark passed through his eyes. "And stay away from the east wing." He vanished inside. Arden leaned against the wall, legs shaking. 1 month. 30 days to prove herself to the most dangerous man in Chicago. 30 days to hide from the people hunting her. 30 days to keep her son safe in a house full of shadows. She looked up. 2nd floor window. A figure watching from behind the curtain. He was already watching. Arden held Jasper tighter and walked toward the garden. She had no idea what secrets this place held. No idea what darkness lived inside these walls. But for her son, she would face all of it. If this story gripped you, smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Drop a like to share this journey with others. And stay tuned, because this is just the beginning. Arden circled around to the back of the mansion in the direction Kian had indicated. Jasper slept soundly in the carrier, his steady breathing a soft warmth against her chest. The shed sat tucked behind a hedge, a small structure of oak wood darkened by time. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, and the smell of damp earth and old fertilizer rushed up into her nose. Gardening tools hung neatly along the wall. Shovels, hoes, pruning shears, all of them coated in a thin film of dust, as if no one had touched them in a long while. Arden took a small spade and a pair of gloves, then stepped back out and headed toward the rear garden Kian had mentioned. When she reached it, her heart sank. This wasn't a garden. This was a graveyard of flowers. Weeds rose to her knees, spreading everywhere like invaders laying claim to abandoned ground. The beds that had once been brilliant were now nothing but withered stumps, twisted and reaching upward like fingers pleading for rescue. Vines crawled over the stone statues, cloaking them in a bleak blue-green. But one thing still held its ground in the middle of that ruin. Arden moved toward the old oak at the center of the garden. Its trunk was so wide 3 people couldn't have wrapped their arms around it, its canopy fanning out like a massive umbrella that cast shade over the earth below. And right beneath it, she saw it. A small stone marker, only about a foot high, half swallowed by the weeds. Arden knelt, using her hand to sweep the grass aside so she could read the words carved into it. E.A. Forever in bloom. Forever in bloom. She stood and looked around the devastated garden. Someone had been buried here. Or at least, remembered here. E. A. What did those initials mean? Arden turned back to the shed to get more tools. And that was when she saw it on the high shelf. An old notebook, its leather cover worn pale, wedged between bottles of pesticide and fertilizer. She reached up, pulled it down, and opened it. Inside were careful notes about every plant, every planting season, every kind of soil that suited it best. The handwriting was graceful, feminine, slanting slightly to the right, each line laid down with love. David Austin roses, plant in March, water twice a day when the weather is hot. Lavender, needs well-draining soil, prune after the blooms fade. Tulips, plant the bulbs in autumn, they'll bloom in early spring. Whoever had written these pages loved the garden the way someone loves their own life. Footsteps made Arden lift her head. An older woman was walking toward her, a bottle of water in her hand. She wore salt and pepper hair twisted into a neat bun at the back of her head, a severe face softened only by the warmth tucked away in her eyes. This had to be the housekeeper Arden had spoken with on the phone. "You're Arden," the woman said, not a question but a statement. "I'm Maggie. I manage this house. You need to drink some water. The sun's going to be harsher in a few hours." Arden accepted the bottle and thanked her. But her gaze stayed on the notebook in her hands. Maggie saw it, and her expression changed, just for a moment. But Arden caught it. "This notebook," Arden said softly. "Who does it belong to?" Maggie was silent for a long time. Her eyes drifted to the distance, to where the old oak stood rigid in the middle of the wild garden. "It belonged to Mrs. Eleanor," she said at last, her voice lower, as if she were afraid someone might hear. "Mr. Ashford's mother." Arden felt her breathing grow heavier. "His mother. Arden hesitated. "She's gone, isn't she?" Maggie nodded, her lips pressed tight. "Never ask him about this. Do you hear me? Never." "But," Arden looked toward the marker beneath the oak. "How did she die?" Maggie didn't answer right away. She studied Arden for a long moment, as though weighing whether she should speak at all. Then she turned her head, looking toward the oak, and the old eyes suddenly glossed with moisture. "Right here in this garden," she said, her voice almost a whisper. 20 years ago, and he witnessed all of it. He was only 15. Maggie said nothing more. She turned and walked away, her small figure slowly disappearing behind the hedge. Arden stood there, the notebook still in her hands, watching the housekeeper until she was gone. Then she turned back to the stone marker under the oak. E. A. Eleanor Ashford, the woman who had died in this very garden, and the 15-year-old boy who had seen everything. Now she understood why Kian Ashford's eyes were cold as steel. The first 3 days passed like a whirlwind. Arden worked from early morning until dusk fell, stopping only to nurse Jasper and change his diaper. She pulled weeds, cleared away dead flower beds, turned the soil, and began replanting whatever could still be salvaged. Eleanor's notebook became her compass, each yellowed page guiding her in how to bring a dead garden back to life. But through all of it, Arden couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Every time she lifted her head, her eyes drifted, without thinking, toward the second-floor window of the mansion, and she saw a figure standing there, only a faint silhouette behind the curtain, but she knew who it was. Kian Ashford was watching her. She didn't know why, and she didn't dare ask. She only lowered her head and kept working. On the afternoon of the third day, while Arden was pruning dry rose canes, a man stepped into the garden. He looked about 35, with neatly cut, short brown hair, tall in a gray suit. The smile on his mouth was friendly, but his eyes were as sharp and cold as a razor. "You're Arden Shaw, right?" he asked, stopping a few steps away. "I'm Jace Brennan. I work for Mr. Ashford." Arden stood, brushing dirt from her gloves. "Yes, I'm Arden. What do you need?" Jace didn't answer right away. He looked around the garden, nodding as if he were evaluating her work. Then his gaze settled on Jasper asleep in the cloth cradle beneath the oak's shade. "You're raising your child alone," Jace said, his tone as ordinary as if he were talking about the weather. "Your husband was Troy Vance, wasn't he?" Arden felt the blood in her veins turn to ice. Troy. The name she'd tried to bury for more than a year. "He's dead," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "A car accident, 14 months ago." Jace tilted his head, watching her closely. "An accident," he repeated. "Or murdered." Arden went rigid. It felt like someone had punched her in the stomach. Murdered. The two words echoed in her mind, drilling into doubts she'd never allowed herself to name. Troy had been an abuser, a gambler, a man who owed money everywhere he went, but she'd always believed he'd died in an accident. The police said so. The death certificate said so. "I don't understand what you're saying," Arden said, her voice trembling slightly. Jace studied her for a few seconds longer, then smiled. The smile didn't reach his eyes. "It's nothing, just a habit of running background checks. Go on with your work." He turned and walked away, leaving Arden standing there with 1,000 questions spinning in her head. Had Troy really died in an accident? Or had someone killed him? And if so, was that person looking for her? In the study on the second floor, Jace stood before Kian's desk, reporting what he'd found. "She's clean," Jace said. "No criminal record. Works hard. Doesn't cause problems." Kian didn't look at him. He stood by the window, staring down at the garden below, where Arden had gone back to work. She had Jasper in her arms, rocking him gently to lull him to sleep among the flower beds she'd just replanted. "But," Jace went on, her ex-husband was Troy Vance. He owed Conrad Mercer $50,000. Kian turned, his gaze sharpening. "Mercer?" "Yes." Jace nodded. "And Mercer isn't the kind of man who lets things go. Even if Troy's dead, he'll still collect from the family." Silence spread through the room. Kian turned back to the window. Arden was singing something to Jasper, her voice light as wind, carrying up through the glass that was cracked open. "She doesn't know anything about that debt. She's just a mother trying to protect her child. The way his mother had once tried to protect him." "Protect her," Kian said, his voice low and final. "But don't let her know." Jace nodded and walked out. But before he closed the door, he looked back at Kian with a curious expression. In 20 years of working together, this was the first time he'd seen his boss care about anyone beyond the work. By the end of the first weekend, the garden had begun to show signs of life again. Arden had cleared nearly 1/3 of the weeds and replanted the flower beds according to the precise instructions in Eleanor's notebook. Purple pansies were already pushing their heads up through the soil, and the newly planted lavender bushes released a soft, calming fragrance into the evening breeze. That morning, Arden laid Jasper on a soft blanket beneath the canopy of the old oak, where cool shade sheltered him from the sun. She handed him a few toys, then turned to water the newly planted rose beds several yards away. Jasper was 7 months old and had begun to crawl, but she thought that if she turned her back for just a moment, it would be fine. She was wrong. Jasper grew bored with the familiar toys. His clear blue eyes were drawn to a yellow butterfly fluttering near the stone step about 15 feet away. He began to crawl, tiny hands pressing into the grass, knees inching forward toward the butterfly. The blanket was quickly forgotten behind him. Arden was focused on watering, her back to her son. She didn't hear Jasper moving, didn't see the butterfly luring him closer and closer to the stone ledge. The step was nearly a foot high, enough to badly injure a 7-month-old baby if he fell. Jasper reached the edge of the grass where it met the stone. The yellow butterfly settled on the surface below as if teasing him. The baby reached out, his small body tipping forward. 1 more second and he would have fallen, but he didn't. A large, steady hand caught Jasper from behind, lifting him into the air before his head could strike the stone. Arden turned at the sound, and her heart nearly stopped. Kian Ashford stood there, Jasper in his arms, his face expressionless, though his breathing was slightly uneven. He had appeared from somewhere, perhaps from the narrow path leading into the garden that she hadn't noticed, and he had saved her son. Jasper didn't cry. Instead, he stared at the unfamiliar man holding him with wide, curious eyes. Then he reached out his tiny hand, wrapped it around Kian's finger, and smiled. Kian froze. Arden saw it. She saw the way his body went rigid, the way his gray eyes flickered with something that looked almost like confusion. Jasper's small hand gripped his finger, those delicate fingers like petals curling around the rough hand of a Mafia king. It had been 20 years since Kian had held a child, and the sensation was painfully familiar. His mother had held his hand like this, when he was a boy, when she was still alive, when this garden had been filled with laughter instead of grief. She would take his hand and lead him between the flower beds, telling him the name of each bloom, teaching him how to care for them. Her hand had been warm and gentle, just like the tiny hand holding him now. "I'm sorry." Arden's voice pulled him back to the present. She ran toward them, her face pale with fear. "I didn't know he'd crawled away. I'm sorry. I should have been paying closer attention. Kian looked at her, then down at Jasper, who was still clutching his finger and grinning. He had to apply a little pressure to free himself, and when he did, he felt a strange sense of loss. He placed Jasper back into Arden's arms, his voice as cold as ever, though his hand trembled faintly. "Be more careful," he said shortly. Then he turned and walked away without looking back. His steps were faster than usual, as if he were running from something. Or rather, running from a feeling he'd believed he'd buried 20 years ago. Arden stood there, holding Jasper tightly against her chest, watching Kian's back disappear beyond the corner of the mansion. Her heart was still racing from fear, but something else was slipping quietly into her thoughts. She had seen it. Just a flicker. Just a few brief seconds when Jasper had taken his hand. But she had seen it. The steel in Kian Ashford's eyes had softened, if only for a moment, when he looked at her son. That night, Arden was jolted awake by a strange noise outside the cabin. She lay still in the darkness, listening. Footsteps on gravel. The low murmur of 2 male voices. Her heart began to pound. Slowly, carefully, she pushed herself upright and glanced toward the crib where Jasper was sleeping peacefully. Moonlight slipped through the gap in the curtains, enough for her to make out the shadows of 2 men moving past the window. They didn't look like the estate's security. "Troy still owed Mercer," one of the men said, his voice rough and cold. 50,000, the wife pays. "Find her and the kid," the other replied. Mercer said, "If there's no money, we take the boy. A hostage works too." The blood drained from Arden's body. Mercer. The name Jace had mentioned the afternoon before. The 50,000 Troy had owed. And now the debt collectors had found her hiding place. She slipped out of bed without a sound and lifted Jasper as gently as she could so she wouldn't wake him. The baby stirred but didn't cry. Arden retreated into the darkest corner of the cabin, crouching behind an old wooden wardrobe, clutching her son tightly against her chest. Her heart thundered in her ears. She could hear the 2 men rummaging outside, shoving plant pots aside, lifting loose boards. They were looking for a way in, and she had nothing to defend herself with. Then suddenly, the noise stopped. A voice cut through the night, low and cold as ice, and Arden stopped breathing. "You're standing on my land." She knew that voice. Kian Ashford. "Who the hell are you?" one of the collectors demanded, still aggressive but edged now with uncertainty. "I'm the owner of this property," Kian replied, "and you're very close to never leaving it again." Silence stretched for several seconds. Then came a frantic whisper. "It's Ashford. God, it's Kian Ashford. We've got to go. You have 10 seconds to disappear from my sight," Kian said, his tone no louder yet filled with threat. "Next time you won't be walking away on your own legs." Footsteps pounded against gravel, retreating fast. An engine roared to life and sped off into the night. Silence returned. Arden remained curled in the dark corner, holding Jasper, afraid to move. Then the cabin door opened. Moonlight flooded in, outlining Kian's tall frame in the doorway. Behind him, Arden caught sight of 2 other men in black suits, clearly his. "Come out," Kian said. "They're gone." Arden rose slowly, her legs trembling. She stepped out of the shadows, Jasper still asleep in her arms. Kian's face showed nothing as he looked at her, but his gray eyes swept the room as if assessing for any remaining threat. "You owe Conrad Mercer," he said. It wasn't a question. Arden lowered her head. "Not me. Troy. My husband." She drew in a steady breath and continued. "He was abusive. A gambler. I didn't know about the debt until after he died. They came for the money. I didn't have it. They threatened to kill me, to hurt Jasper. So I ran." She looked down at her son, sleeping peacefully, unaware of how close danger had come. "I've been running for 14 months. I thought coming here would mean safety. I didn't know they were still watching." Kian was silent for a long moment. He looked at Arden, at Jasper, then out into the darkness where the collectors had vanished. When he spoke again, his voice remained cold, but there was something else beneath it. Something Arden couldn't quite name. "From now on, you and the baby will stay in the main house. The cabin isn't secure." Arden looked up at him, startled. "But I'm just the gardener. I can't stay in the main house." Kian didn't answer. He turned and stepped toward the door, then paused without looking back. "Why are you helping me?" Arden asked, her voice almost a whisper. He was quiet for a few seconds. Then he said, his voice low and final, "It's not an offer. It's an order." He walked into the darkness and disappeared, the two men in black following behind him. Arden stood there, Jasper in her arms, watching his figure until it faded from sight. She didn't understand why the coldest mafia boss in Chicago would protect an unknown gardener. But she knew one thing. The line between employer and employee had begun to blur. Early the next morning, Maggie prepared a room on the first floor for Arden and Jasper. It was small but warm, with a window that looked out over the garden Arden had been tending. An old oak crib was brought down from the attic. Maggie said it was the very crib Kian had slept in as a baby. Arden didn't dare ask anything more. She simply thanked her quietly and began arranging their few belongings. She continued working in the garden each day, but now she felt safer. Kian's security men were always somewhere within sight, never close enough to make her uncomfortable, yet near enough that she knew she was being protected. On the third night after moving into the main house, Arden woke at 2 o'clock in the morning. Jasper was crying for milk. She lifted him, soothed him for a moment, then decided to go downstairs to warm a bottle. She walked along the dark hallway, barefoot, her steps soft against the wooden floor. The house was still in the night, save for the distant ticking of a clock. As she passed the living room, she slowed. In the dim light, she saw a figure seated on the sofa. Moonlight streamed through the window, outlining Kian's form, his back against the cushions, a bottle of whiskey on the table before him. The glass in his hand was half empty. Arden meant to slip past without disturbing him, but his voice rose from the darkness, low and tired. "Today is the day my mother died. 20 years ago." Arden stopped. She didn't know what to say. Didn't even know if she should say anything at all. Jasper shifted restlessly in her arms, hungry. She looked at Kian for a long moment, then quietly stepped into the living room and sat in the chair opposite him. She didn't ask questions. She didn't speak. She simply fed Jasper, holding her child close, letting the baby settle into silence. The room was wrapped in stillness. Only the soft sound of Jasper nursing and the steady breathing of the three of them filled the air. Kian stared down into his glass, turning it slowly between his fingers. Perhaps Arden's silence made him feel safe. Perhaps the darkness concealed enough for him to open himself. Or perhaps, after 20 years of keeping everything buried, he simply needed someone to listen. "My mother loved that garden more than anything," he began, his voice low as if speaking to himself. "She planted every flower, cared for every blade of grass. She used to say the garden was the only place she felt peace in my father's chaotic world." He paused and took a swallow of whiskey. Arden remained silent, but she absorbed every word. "One day, my father's enemies broke in." Kian continued. "They couldn't find him, so they went after what he valued most. That was my mother." His voice trembled faintly, yet he went on. "She was gardening, right beneath the oak. She didn't even have a chance to run." The silence deepened. Arden felt her throat tighten. "I was 15, Kian said, almost in a whisper. "I stood there, at the second-floor window. I saw everything, and I did nothing. Nothing at all." He set the glass down, his hands unsteady. "From that day on, I swore I'd never let anyone get close to me again. Because the people who stand close to me become targets. They get hurt. They die." He lifted his head and looked at Arden through the dim light. His gray eyes caught the moon, and for the first time, she saw the pain inside them. A pain 20 years old that hadn't faded. She said nothing. Slowly, she placed her hand on the table near his, not touching, just there, a small gesture that said she was present, that she was listening, that she wasn't judging. Jasper had fallen asleep in her arms, his breathing soft, and even like a lullaby. The room settled into silence again, but this time it was warm, not heavy. "Aren't you afraid of me?" Kian asked suddenly. "Knowing who I am, knowing what I've done, knowing the kind of world I live in, you're still not afraid." Arden met his gaze, her eyes steady. "I've lived with a real monster before," she said gently. "A man who beat me every day. A man who made me afraid inside my own home. You don't frighten me." The quiet stretched between them. Kian looked at her, and for the first time in 20 years, he felt that someone truly saw him. Not the boss, not the killer, just a man with wounds that had never healed. And that night, in the darkness, the wall he had built over 2 decades began to show its first cracks. 3 weeks passed like a dream. The once desolate garden had come back to life beneath Arden's careful hands. She worked each day from early morning until late afternoon, following every page of Eleanor's notebook. The David Austin roses bloomed in soft blush, pink and creamy white, their fragrance drifting through the air and settling gently over the paths. Purple lavender bordered the stone walkway, and red and yellow tulips rose proudly from the lush green lawn she had painstakingly restored. The old oak still stood in its quiet dignity, but now a circle of white daisies and violet pansies surrounded its base, just as Eleanor had written in her notes 20 years earlier. The small stone marker engraved with E.A., forever in bloom, was no longer hidden beneath weeds. It rested peacefully among the blossoms, as though the woman remembered there had finally been laid to rest within the beauty she had once loved. That afternoon, Arden sat on the grass, watching Jasper crawl in uneven circles, fascinated by fallen petals. He was nearly 8 months old now, more energetic each day, curious about everything within reach. She smiled at him, feeling a deeper peace than she'd known in a long time. Then she heard footsteps on gravel. She looked up and her heart skipped. Kian was walking into the garden. It was the first time she had seen him set foot there since she began working. He moved slowly along the stone path, gray eyes sweeping over the garden with an expression she couldn't read. Arden rose to her feet, her pulse quickening. She didn't know how he would react. He might be angry that she had changed so much without asking. He might feel pain standing in the place where his mother had died. He might send her away. Kian passed her without a word. He walked straight to the old oak and stopped before the stone marker. His back was to her, and she couldn't see his face. Silence stretched. 1 minute, then another. Arden stood at a distance, her hands clasped tightly together, not daring to approach. She could only wait. Then Kian turned around, and Arden saw something she never thought she would witness. The cold gray eyes of Kian Ashford were wet. "I read her notebook," he said, his voice rougher than usual. Arden nodded, her throat tightening. "I'm sorry if I shouldn't have. I just thought it was the best way to restore the garden. I didn't mean to offend you or cause you pain. I'm sorry." Kian shook his head. "No. You did the right thing." He looked around once more at the blooming flowers, the green lawn, the late afternoon light filtering through the oak branches. "You brought her back," he said quietly, almost as if afraid someone might hear. "For 20 years I couldn't step in here. For 20 years I let it decay because I couldn't bear to look at it. But now, it's exactly as I remember, exactly as it was when she was alive." A burst of laughter broke the fragile moment. Jasper had crawled to Kian's feet without anyone noticing, and now sat on the grass, clapping his hands at him. His blue eyes sparkled in the golden light, his mouth open in a wide grin that revealed a newly emerging tooth. Kian looked down at the child. Then, without a word, he lowered himself onto the grass. Arden held her breath. She had never seen Kian sit on the ground like that, never seen him bring himself down to anyone's level. But there he was, seated on the green lawn beside her son. Jasper didn't hesitate. He immediately crawled toward Kian and pulled himself onto the man's lap, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. His tiny hands clutched at the front of Kian's suit jacket, laughter bubbling out of him in delight. Kian didn't push him away. He simply sat there, allowing Jasper to explore his lap, his gray eyes resting on the child with something Arden could only describe as tenderness. Arden watched them in the glow of the late afternoon sun, the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago, and a 7-month-old baby, 2 figures so starkly different, yet somehow unexpectedly harmonious amid the blooming garden, and she understood. The man wasn't cold. He had simply been alone for far too long. That morning, Kian left the estate early for a meeting downtown. Arden watched his sleek black car glide past the gates from her bedroom window, then carried Jasper down to the garden as she did every day. The baby had grown used to spending his mornings outdoors, sitting in his stroller beneath the trees while his mother worked. It felt like an ordinary day. At least, that was what Arden believed. She was trimming wilted rose branches when she heard the unfamiliar rumble of an engine. She looked up toward the gates. A black SUV had stopped at the entrance. It wasn't Kian's car, nor did it belong to anyone from the estate she recognized. The guards at the gate were speaking to someone, and then she saw them being pushed aside, not violently, but firmly enough that they couldn't interfere. 4 men entered the grounds. Leading them was a middle-aged man, tall, silver hair slicked back, dressed in an expensive gray suit. But it wasn't his appearance that made Arden's blood run cold. It was his eyes. cold and calculating like a venomous snake. He looked straight at her and smiled. There wasn't a trace of warmth in it. Arden's heart began to pound. She moved closer to the stroller, placing a hand on it as if ready to lift Jasper at any second. The silver-haired man approached, his men trailing behind him like shadows. He stopped a few yards from her, his gaze sweeping over her from head to toe before settling on Jasper sitting wide-eyed in the stroller. "Troy Vance's widow," he said, his voice low and oily. "Prettier than I expected." Troy had good taste in women. Arden felt sick hearing her husband's name on his lips. "Who are you?" she asked, forcing her voice to remain steady despite her racing heart. "Conrad Mercer," he replied, as though the name alone explained everything. And for Arden, it did. Mercer, the man Troy had owed $50,000. The one who had sent men to the cabin that night. The man even Kian Ashford regarded as a threat. "I don't owe you anything," Arden said, stepping back and pulling the stroller with her. "That debt was Troy's. He's dead." Mercer gave a thin smile. "Death doesn't erase debt, girl. Someone pays. And you're the only family he left behind. I don't have money. I have nothing." Mercer tilted his head, glancing at Jasper. The baby stared back with clear blue eyes, too innocent to understand fear. $50,000, Mercer said slowly, enunciating every word. "Or the boy. You choose." The blood drained from Arden's face. She lunged for the stroller, scooping Jasper into her arms and holding him tightly against her chest. "No," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Never." Mercer shrugged as if it were a minor inconvenience. He gestured for his men to step forward. "Then we'll do this the hard way." Before they could take another step, a voice rang out behind them. "Step away from her. Now." Arden turned. Maggie stood at the back door, a handgun steady in her grasp, the barrel aimed directly at Mercer. The elderly housekeeper's face was calm to the point of chilling, as if pointing a gun at a crime lord were simply another household task. Mercer looked at Maggie and laughed. "Brave old woman, you think you can shoot all four of us." Maggie didn't flinch. "I've been in this house for 30 years, she said evenly. "I've buried more men than you can imagine, and I only need to shoot one, you." The silence that followed was tight as wire. Mercer looked at Maggie, then at the gun in her hand, then around the garden. He was calculating. At last, he lifted a hand, signaling his men to stand down. "Fine," he said, that faint smile still on his lips. "I'll leave today." He turned back to Arden for one last look. "But tell Ashford this. 50,000 and the girl. Or I'll take more than that." Then he walked away, his men following close behind. The black SUV roared off, leaving Arden trembling in the garden, clutching Jasper to her chest. Kian returned an hour later. He stormed into the estate like a gathering storm, his face pale when Maggie told him what had happened. He found Arden in the living room, still shaking, Jasper asleep in her arms. "He dared to touch you," Kian said, his voice low and dangerous, like the growl of a predator. "He dared to threaten Jasper." Arden looked up, his gray eyes burned with fury, and his hands trembled slightly. "Not from fear, from rage. From now on, you don't leave the sight of security," he said firmly. "Never." Arden wanted to protest, but exhaustion and fear weighed heavily on her. "I'm not a prisoner," she said softly. Kian held her gaze, and his voice softened. "No, you're not a prisoner. You're someone I'll protect at any cost." That night, Kian called Jason to his study. "Mercer wants war," he said coldly, his gray eyes hard as steel. "He'll have war, but not the kind he's expecting." A few days after Mercer's visit, the atmosphere inside the estate grew tighter, heavier. Security was reinforced, and the quiet, private calls between Kian and Jace became more frequent. But for Arden, her greatest fear wasn't Mercer. It was Jasper. The baby had begun crying more at night, refusing to nurse, restless and irritable. Arden thought he might be teething, so she didn't worry too much. Until the third night, she woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of Jasper's weak cry. When she placed her hand on his forehead, her heart dropped into darkness. Hot, burning hot. She shot upright, switched on the lamp, and looked closely at her son. Jasper's face was flushed deep red, his blue eyes dull and unfocused, no longer bright with curiosity. His little body felt limp in her arms. He didn't even have the strength to cry loudly, only soft, pitiful whimpers. "Baby," Arden whispered, her voice shaking. "Mommy's here." She tried to stay calm, but panic rose fast and merciless. She had no car, no way to call for help herself. There was only one person who could save her son. Arden lifted Jasper and ran from the room, her bare feet striking the cold wooden floor. She climbed the stairs and hurried down the second-floor hallway to Kian's door. She knocked hard, not caring that it was 2 a.m, not caring that he was her employer and she only the gardener. She only knew her son was sick and she needed help. The door opened almost immediately. Kian stood there, dark hair disheveled, shirt slightly undone as if sleep hadn't truly claimed him either. But the moment he saw Arden holding Jasper, he was fully alert. "What happened?" he demanded, already focused on the baby. "He's burning up," Arden choked out. "I don't know what to do. I don't have a car. I don't know who to call. Please, I need to get him to a hospital." Kian didn't waste a second. He grabbed his keys and jacket and stepped back out, taking Arden firmly by the arm. "Come with me." He didn't call a driver, didn't call Jace, didn't call anyone. He drove himself, racing into the Chicago night. His car tore through the empty streets, city lights streaking past the windows. One hand gripped the steering wheel, the other held Arden's tightly. "He'll be fine," Kian said, his voice low but unyielding. "I promise you, he'll be fine." Through her tears, Arden looked at him, and for the first time, she saw something in Kian Ashford's gray eyes she'd never seen before. Fear. He was afraid. Afraid for Jasper. Afraid of losing the child he had begun to love without even realizing it. They reached the hospital in less than 15 minutes. Kian parked directly in front of the emergency entrance, ignoring the posted signs. He opened Arden's door and ran with her inside, Jasper limp in her arms. Everything that followed felt unreal. Doctors and nurses rushed in. Tests, fever reducers, examination, waiting. Finally, a doctor returned. "It's an ear infection," he explained gently to Arden. "The fever is high because his body's fighting the infection. We'll start antibiotics and monitor him overnight. There's nothing to worry about. He'll recover in a few days." Relief shattered Arden's composure. Tears streamed down her face. She turned to Kian and saw his shoulders lower, as though a crushing weight had just been lifted. They were shown to a small hospital room for the night. Jasper lay sleeping on the bed, medication beginning to cool his fever. His tiny face was no longer flushed, only faintly pink and peaceful. Arden sat beside him, holding his little hand. Kian sat silently on the worn sofa, saying nothing, simply present. "You can go home," Arden murmured. "It's late. You have important things to do. I'll be fine." Kian didn't answer, and he didn't leave. A while later, a nurse came in to check Jasper's vitals. She noted something on her chart, then glanced at Kian. "You're the baby's father, right?" she asked casually. Silence fell. Arden's heart began to race again. She expected Kian to correct her, to say he was only the employer, only the man who had brought them here. But Kian looked at Jasper sleeping, then at Arden, and he answered, his voice steady and sure. "Yes, I'm his father." Arden's tears came again, deeper this time. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond. She only knew her heart felt as though it were melting inside her chest, that no one had ever given her something so quietly beautiful. The nurse nodded, made another note, and left. Jasper continued to sleep, his breathing even and soft. And Arden, unable to hold back any longer, leaned into Kian's shoulder and wept. She cried from relief, from gratitude, from months of loneliness and fear finally shared. And Kian, for the first time, wrapped his arms around her. He didn't speak. He simply held her. In that small hospital room beneath the muted lights, the three of them looked like a family. Perhaps, in some quiet way, they had been one for longer than they realized. 3 o'clock in the morning, and the hospital lay wrapped in silence. The corridors were empty, save for the faint ticking of a clock and the occasional soft footsteps of a night nurse making her rounds. In the small room, Jasper slept deeply after the antibiotics, his fever gradually easing, his breathing steady and peaceful. Arden sat in the chair beside his bed, her head resting lightly against the mattress, her eyes fixed on her son's sleeping face. She couldn't sleep, though her body was worn to the bone. Kian sat on the sofa across from her, his back against the wall, gray eyes turned toward the window where the Chicago skyline flickered in the distance. He wasn't sleeping either. Kian's phone vibrated, shattering the stillness. He glanced at the screen, then stood and stepped into the hallway to answer it. Arden could hear his voice through the slightly open door, low and cold. "Jace, what is it?" A pause, then Jace's voice, faint but clear enough. "Mercer burned one of our warehouses at the harbor tonight. The damage is significant. He's escalating." Kian didn't sound surprised. He didn't even sound angry. His voice was calm, in a way that was almost chilling. "He's digging his own grave. Send more evidence to the FBI. Everything we have on his trafficking ring. It's time to end this game." He ended the call and returned to the room. This time, he sat closer, in the chair beside Arden. "Is it serious?" she asked quietly. "Nothing you need to worry about," Kian replied. "Just business." Silence settled again. Arden studied him in the dim light, the fatigue etched into his features, the way his gray eyes drifted back to Jasper. She truly didn't understand. "Why are you here?" she asked softly. "You have an empire to run. You have enemies burning your warehouses. You have 100 more important things to do than sit in a hospital room with a gardener and her child." Kian turned to her. "Because this is where I need to be," he said simply. Arden shook her head. "You don't owe us anything. I'm just someone you hired to tend a garden. Jasper is only a child you happened to meet. You have no obligation to us." Kian was quiet for a long moment. Then he exhaled, a heavy breath, as though reaching for words he had never spoken aloud. "You don't understand," he said at last, his voice lower now. "I built a wall around myself for 20 years. No one got in. No one came close. I didn't allow anyone to touch me. Not physically, not emotionally." He looked at Jasper sleeping, then back at Arden. "And then you appeared, with that baby, in my mother's garden. You stood there trembling, tears in your eyes, and still you lifted your chin and said you'd work harder than anyone else. You weren't afraid of me. You looked into my eyes as if I were just a man, not a monster." He swallowed, and everything cracked. "The wall I spent 20 years building started to split, and I couldn't stop it." Arden said nothing. She didn't know what to say. Kian reached for her hand, gently but firmly. He turned her palm upward, studying the roughened skin from hours in the soil, the small scratches from rose thorns, the stubborn stains that never quite washed away. "You've worked too hard," he murmured. "These hands have carried too much." Arden lowered her gaze, suddenly shy. "I wanted to deserve the chance you gave me," she whispered. "I didn't want you to think you were wrong to trust me." Kian lifted his eyes to hers. His gray gaze was no longer cold. It was warm now, steady, filled with words that trembled just beneath the surface. "You deserve more than anything I can offer," he said, his voice deep and sincere. "You deserve more than a gardening job, more than a room in my house, more than my protection. You deserve happiness, Arden, and I want to be the one who gives it to you." Tears slid down Arden's cheeks, and she didn't try to stop them. She let them fall, as though releasing years of loneliness and quiet suffering. Kian didn't wipe them away. He simply tightened his hold on her hand, their fingers entwining in the darkness. They didn't need more words. They didn't need a kiss. 2 hands clasped together in the stillness of night said everything that mattered. 2 days later, Jasper had fully recovered. The doctor allowed them to leave the hospital with a prescription for antibiotics and careful instructions to monitor him for a few more days. Kian drove them back to the estate, and throughout the journey, his hand would occasionally brush against Arden's, as if he needed to reassure himself that she was still there beside him. Something between them had shifted. Neither of them spoke of it, yet both could feel it clearly. Their glances lingered longer than before. Their hands touched in ways that seemed accidental, but were anything but. The concern they felt for one another was no longer hidden. On the night before the FBI was set to move, Arden couldn't sleep. She carried Jasper down to the garden and sat beneath the old oak, where moonlight filtered through the branches, casting shifting patterns across the grass. Jasper had grown drowsy again, resting quietly in his mother's arms, his half-closed eyes following the gentle sway of leaves overhead. Arden leaned back against the rough trunk and looked at the small stone engraved with Eleanor's name glowing softly under the moon. She thought about the woman who had died in that very place, about the young son who had witnessed it, about the garden that had withered for 20 years and was now in bloom once more. She thought about herself as well, about the long road from an abused wife to a fleeing single mother, and now to a woman in love with a Mafia king. Soft footsteps on the grass made her lift her head. Kian was walking toward her, his tall frame outlined in silver light. He wore a simple white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, looking nothing like the cold figure in tailored suits that the world knew. "I knew you'd be here," he said, lowering himself onto the grass beside her. Jasper was asleep now, his steady breathing warm against Arden's chest. "I couldn't sleep," she murmured. Kian nodded. Neither could I. They sat in silence for a while, gazing up at the star-scattered sky. "Tomorrow, it ends," Kian said at last, his voice calm and steady. "The FBI will move in. Mercer will be arrested. He won't be a threat to you or Jasper again." Arden turned to look at him. And after that, Kian didn't answer right away. He studied the ground as though weighing each word. "After that," he said slowly, "you'll be free. You can go wherever you want. Start over. I'll give you money, enough for you and Jasper to live comfortably. You won't have to worry about anything again." Arden felt her heart sink. "Not with you." Kian lifted his gaze to hers. His gray eyes held emotions she had never seen so openly before. Pain, uncertainty, and something fragile that looked like hope. "I don't want you to stay because you have no other choice," he said, his voice rougher now. "I want you to stay because you want to. Not because you need shelter. Not because you're afraid of Mercer. Not because you have nowhere else to go." "And if I don't want a life without you?" Arden asked softly. Kian held her gaze in silence. Then he shifted closer, sitting face to face with her in the pale light. "I'm a dangerous man, Arden," he said seriously. "I've done terrible things. I've killed. I've ruined lives. The world I live in is filled with darkness and blood. Are you certain you want to live in that world?" Arden looked straight into his eyes without flinching. "I know who you are," she said firmly. "I know what you've done. I'm not naive." She paused, lifting her free hand to touch his cheek. "But I also know you saved my son in the middle of the night. You protected us when no one else would. You cried at your mother's grave after 20 years. You looked at my child as if he were your own. Dangerous men don't do those things." Kian raised his hand and touched her face, gently, as if afraid she might shatter beneath his fingers. His thumb brushed her cheek, her temple, her hair. "If you stay," he whispered, his voice thick with feeling, "I'll never let anyone hurt you or Jasper again. Never. That's a promise." Arden placed her hand over his and held it firmly. "I'm staying," she said simply, with quiet certainty. They sat beneath the old oak, hands entwined, Jasper sleeping peacefully between them. Above, through the canopy of leaves, the stars shimmered like silent witnesses to the vow made in the stillness of night, and if Eleanor was watching from somewhere beyond, she would see that her son had finally found his way home. The next day began before dawn. Kian left the estate at 3 a.m, before the sun had even touched the edge of the Chicago skyline. Arden couldn't sleep. She lay in bed with her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, listening to every sound that moved through the night. She heard the roar of Kian's car as it sped away, the measured footsteps of security guards patrolling outside, the wind stirring the branches of the old oak in the garden. And she waited. Maggie had explained everything to her. Kian had been gathering evidence against Conrad Mercer for years, not only the illegal debt collection or the threats against innocent people, but an entire human trafficking network stretching from Chicago down to the southern border. The evidence had been handed over to the FBI, and today was the day they would act. Kian's men were positioned throughout the estate, alert and ready. Jace remained behind to protect Arden and Jasper, along with 6 others guarding every entrance. But Maggie had said they likely wouldn't have to intervene. Mercer wouldn't have the chance to fight back. The hours that followed dragged on like a long nightmare. Arden carried Jasper and paced the room, unable to sit still. She turned on the television to follow the news, her heart pounding every time a breaking alert flashed across the screen. And then, at 7 a.m, the headline she had been waiting for finally appeared. Notorious crime boss Conrad Mercer arrested in the largest FBI Chicago operation of the decade, the anchor announced with grave composure, along with more than 30 associates. Mercer is accused of operating an international human trafficking ring, involving hundreds of victims. Authorities state that the evidence is extensive and overwhelming, making prosecution almost certain to succeed. Arden exhaled as tears spilled down her face. She sank onto the sofa, clutching Jasper tightly against her chest, her body trembling with relief. It was over. Mercer would never threaten her again. Jasper would be safe. She would be safe. But Kian hadn't returned. She kept waiting, her eyes fixed on the iron gates beyond the window. Jace received several phone calls, nodding, offering brief replies, but he told her nothing. She didn't dare ask, afraid the answer might shatter the fragile peace she was clinging to. The sky darkened and then lightened again. Arden laid Jasper in his crib when he grew sleepy, but she remained in the living room. She sat there, watching the door, waiting. At dawn the following morning, just as the first pale light brushed the horizon, Kian's car finally rolled through the gates. Arden shot to her feet, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. She hurried to the door but stopped at the threshold when she saw him step out of the car. He looked exhausted, his suit wrinkled, his dark hair disordered. But he was walking toward her, and he was safe. Kian entered the house and stopped in front of her. "It's over," he said, his voice rough from lack of sleep. "Mercer's been arrested. All of them have. You're safe now." Arden studied him, noticing the small bruise across his knuckles, the fatigue lining his gray eyes. "Are you all right?" she asked softly, reaching out to touch his hand. Kian glanced down at the bruise and then smiled. It was a faint smile, but it was the first genuine one she had ever seen from him. Not Paulette, not ironic, but the smile of a man who could finally breathe again. "Just hit it on a car door," he said lightly. "Nothing serious." They walked together into the living room and sat beside the crib where Jasper was sleeping. As if sensing their presence, the baby stirred and opened his eyes. His clear blue gaze wandered around the room before settling on Kian, and Jasper broke into a wide grin, lifting his tiny arms, babbling happily. "Dada." Arden held her breath. Kian looked at the child, and she saw something shift in his eyes. Softness. Love. Without hesitation, Kian rose and stepped to the crib. He bent down and lifted Jasper gently into his arms, holding him as though he had done it 1,000 times before. Jasper laughed, his little hands patting Kian's cheeks, his mouth forming joyful, meaningless sounds. And Kian held him close, pressing his cheek against the baby's soft hair, closing his eyes as if committing the moment to memory forever. Arden sat there, tears sliding silently down her face, watching the man she loved hold her son as if the child were his own flesh and blood. Because in his heart, Jasper already was his son, and Arden was the woman he intended to protect for the rest of his life. A few days after Mercer's arrest, life inside the Ashford estate gradually returned to something resembling normal. The additional security detail was scaled back, and the tight, restless tension that had lingered for weeks finally began to ease. Maggie resumed preparing her generous, comforting meals. Jace came and went with a smile instead of a guarded expression. But for Arden, nothing was the same. She was no longer the trembling gardener asking for work. She was no longer the single mother running from debt and fear. She was the woman who had held Kian's hand in the middle of the night, who had heard him swear to protect her for the rest of his life, who had chosen to stay. And yet, they had never spoken it plainly, never named what stood between them. Sometimes, in the quiet hours, Arden wondered if it had all been a dream. That morning, she rose early as usual and stepped into the garden to water the flowers. Jasper was still asleep inside under Maggie's watchful care, so she had a rare moment to herself. She cherished mornings like this, when dew clung to the petals and the air carried the rich scent of damp earth. The garden had fully come back to life. Roses bloomed in radiant clusters. Lavender lined the walkways in deep violet waves. The old oak stood tall and dignified, encircled by white daisies surrounding Eleanor's stone marker. Arden had done what she came to do. She had restored the garden to the vision preserved in a long-closed notebook. The question now was what came next. Footsteps on gravel made her turn. Kian was walking toward her, dressed in a simple white shirt and black trousers, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He looked nothing like the cold, distant man she had met more than a month earlier. There was softness in him now, a quiet steadiness. Yet he was still breathtaking to look at. "Coffee," he said, offering 1 cup to her. "You're up early." "I wanted to water the flowers before the sun gets too strong," Arden replied, accepting the cup and taking a sip. They stood together in silence for a moment, watching the garden slowly brighten beneath the first light of day. Then Kian spoke. "There's something I need to say." Arden lowered her hand and turned to him. Her heart began to beat faster, though she didn't know why. "The 1-month trial period ended a while ago," Kian said, his gray eyes steady on hers. You're not my gardener anymore." Arden felt her throat tighten. "Then what am I?" she asked softly. Kian set his coffee down on the stone step and stepped closer. He gently took her cup from her hand and placed it beside his. Then he took her hand, never once breaking eye contact. "You're the woman I love," he said, his voice deep and unwavering. Silence settled around them. Tears welled in Arden's eyes and spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. Those words, simple yet immense, were words she had never imagined hearing from a man like Kian Ashford. He lifted his hand and brushed the tears from her face. "I don't know how to love the right way," he continued, his voice softer now. "I stopped believing in anything 20 years ago. I closed my heart and swore no one would ever enter it again. Then you walked into my life, you and Jasper." He paused and drew a slow breath, and everything changed. "You changed everything. I don't want to wake up without you. I don't want to risk a day when you walk out through those gates and never come back. I don't want to live in this house without Jasper's laughter and your smile filling it." Arden wept openly now, no longer trying to hold herself together. "I love you too," she whispered through tears. "Maybe since the night you sat alone with your whiskey and told me about your mother. Maybe since you saved Jasper from the stone step. Maybe even before that. I don't know. I just know I don't want to be anywhere else but here, with you." Kian stepped closer and rested his forehead against hers. Their breaths mingled in the cool morning air. "Then don't leave," he whispered. "Don't ever leave." "Never," she promised. And for the first time in 20 years, Kian Ashford believed in a promise. 6 months later, the garden of the Ashford estate had become the most beautiful in all of Chicago. Wealthy neighbors would occasionally slow their cars at the gates just to admire it. Home and garden magazines reached out, asking for permission to photograph the grounds. Kian refused every request. This garden belonged to his family. It wasn't meant for display. Arden had transformed a place that had lain in ruin for 20 years into a living masterpiece. Climbing roses wrapped themselves around the old wooden trellis. Purple lavender released its fragrance into the air. Tulips and daffodils bloomed in their seasons, bright and proud. The old oak still stood in quiet dignity, but now it was surrounded by a riot of color, as if Eleanor were smiling from somewhere far beyond sight. Jasper was 13 months old and just learning to walk. His laughter echoed through the house from morning until evening. His favorite place was high on Kian's shoulders as they walked through the garden, his tiny fingers pointing at flowers while he babbled sounds that only the adults in the house seemed to understand. That morning, the long dining table no longer felt cold and empty. Maggie had filled it with warm pancakes, fresh fruit, fried eggs, and a bowl of oatmeal for Jasper. She stood by the stove with a spatula in hand, smiling at the scene before her. Kian sat at the head of the table with Jasper on his lap. The boy was determined to feed himself with a small spoon. Most of the oatmeal ended up smeared across Kian's face instead of inside Jasper's mouth. Kian didn't wipe it away in annoyance. He simply laughed, cleaned the child's cheek, and let him try again. Jace walked in at that moment and stopped at the doorway, taking in the sight. He shook his head, half amused, half astonished. "Where's the cold boss I used to know?" he teased. "The man who once made all of Chicago tremble is now letting a baby paint his face with oatmeal." Kian looked up at him with a gaze that 6 months earlier would have sent anyone stepping back. But now there was humor in his eyes. "He's gone," Kian replied lightly. "Thank God," Jace answered. Arden sat across from them, watching, her heart warmer than it had ever been. She had found home, not simply a house, though this estate had truly become the place she belonged, but something deeper, a place where she was loved, a place where she could be herself. A place where her son could grow surrounded by safety and devotion. That afternoon, as the golden light softened, Kian brought the family into the garden. Jasper sat on his shoulders, clutching his father's hair, laughing. Arden walked beside them, her fingers interlaced with Kian's. They stopped at the old oak, where the small stone marker rested within its circle of white daisies. Kian set Jasper down on the grass and knelt on one knee before the stone. In his hand was a bouquet of fresh flowers Arden had cut that morning. "Mother," he said softly, laying the flowers at the base of the marker. "This is my family. This is Arden, the woman I love, and this is Jasper, your grandson. We wish you could be here to meet them, but I know you're watching over us." Arden knelt beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered toward the stone. "Thank you for leaving this garden behind. It led me here. It led me to your son." It led me to this family. Jasper crawled closer, his tiny hands pressing into the grass. He studied the stone with curious blue eyes, as if trying to understand something beyond his years. Kian lifted him gently. "This is your grandmother," he said tenderly. "She'll always watch over you. Even if she isn't here, she loves you." Jasper clapped and laughed, as if he understood. As if he were telling his grandmother that he loved her too. The three of them stood beneath the oak, the afternoon sun filtering through the leaves and scattering golden light across their faces. Kian held Arden's hand, Jasper secure in his other arm. This was his family. This was the happiness he had once believed he would never have. "You saved me," he murmured to Arden. "You know that. You pulled me out of the darkness I locked myself in for 20 years. Arden smiled, her eyes filled with love. "We saved each other," she replied. 1 year earlier, Arden Shaw had stood before these iron gates with her 7-month-old child, carrying nothing but desperation. She had thought her life was over, but it had only been beginning. Eleanor's garden continued to bloom, as if it had never stopped, and now it was no longer a place that held sorrow. It was where love had begun, where family had been found, where broken hearts learned how to heal, forever in bloom. This story leaves us with a profound reminder about the power of love and healing. No matter how painful the past may be, no matter how deeply life pushes us into the darkest corners, there is always light waiting ahead. Arden teaches us that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward while trembling. Kian shows us that opening one's heart to another isn't weakness, but the bravest act a person can choose. And Jasper, with his clear, bright smile, reminds us that sometimes the purest love arrives from the places we least expect. And what about you? How has this story touched your heart? Have you ever stood at the edge of despair only to find light at the end of the tunnel? Share your story in the comments below. We would truly love to hear what rests in the depths of your heart. If this story has moved you, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next heartfelt story. Leave a like and share this video with the people you love, those who believe in the power of second chances and the miracle of love. We send our warmest wishes to all of you watching today. May you have good health, joyful days, and peaceful hearts. Thank you for walking with us through this story. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you in the next video.